Hello, my name is Virgil Wood, and we're here today to share some information that we believe is going to be helpful. We've been told it's very helpful to many people, and we trust that it will be for you. This is a collaborative of persons who've come together to pool our resources and our work so that communities and people in communities can benefit. I'd like, first of all, to introduce you to Joseph Tasby. Brother Joseph Tasby and I have been colleagues in many ways since the 70s, actually, in Boston days when he was a student at MIT. He has a long career, a wonderful career in education and community development. And he will share now with you some things that he'll just give you a flavor of it now. At a later time, you will be able to hear more of his work in a video that will be a greater length than our time today. Brother Joe, would you share with people, please, your journey and things that you do and will do?
Thank you, Doc. I appreciate it. When I reflect back on me, Joseph Tasby, where I've come from, what I've been through to where I am today, sometimes I'm almost like in a little bit of awe that in spite of my mistakes, in spite of me beating my head against the wall sometime and going down different road, the wrong road, I look at the blessing that God saved me from and brought me through into to where I am today. Growing up in Houston, Texas, I was in a total segregated situation up through high school, all Black. And so I'm from a family, we were poor communities. Of course, we always say we didn't know we were poor until later on. But I'm a product of a broken home. I have three brothers, one passed, but coming up, it was four boys. And when my mother and father busted up, he was an alcoholic and an abusive man. My three brothers moved my mother. This is during junior high and high school. I stayed with my father. And so all that time, this is when I was learning about what goes on in distressed communities. I witnessed almost every Friday night with my father. He was like a portable Las Vegas as far as with the dice game, shooting crap. So I saw many men and women come and lose their whole paychecks. To this day, I don't gamble. And so from that, I was a good football player. We grew up as outdoorsmen, hunter, fishermen, that sort of thing. So I had an understanding of what it took to kind of survive. Because many times, if we didn't have some food, some game we had hunted or some fish we had caught, we didn't have any meat, right? So I won a football scholarship to University of Idaho. At that time, we had teachers and coaches in the Black community that taught us, so we were good students. We had to deal with excellence in ourselves. So I had almost 100 scholarship offers to colleges all across the country. I went to University of Idaho. February the 5th, 1966, I flew out of Houston on Braniff Airways, heading up to Spokane, Washington, 80 miles from Moscow, Idaho. I was there for 4 years. Out of a student body of 8,000, only 13 of us were Black. So I had to deal with a different kind of pushback from white people. Because growing up here in Houston, I would go to Louisiana where my people were from, and I learned about the kind of racism that pushed Black people back, chopping cotton, picking cotton, that sort of thing, and understanding growing up in Houston that there were some things in Texas tough that you did not do, that we were subjected to. And early on, I was involved in civil rights from my high school, working with Dr. Bill Lawson, D. Leon Everett, some other people. So when I went off to college, I had an understanding that one, I had to do well. I was too far away from home to flunk out of school. And we had a camaraderie, the Black students. So we were able to well, not demonstrate, but work with the college administration so that we negotiated and got 2 Black courses during the time I was at Idaho that was not there before. My sophomore year at college, I made Sports Illustrated top 5 super sophomores in the country. The top 5 in the country that the pro scouts were watching. So I knew I was going to play pro ball. It was already laid out, y'all. My junior year, I made all conference. My senior year, I got my knee hurt in fall football camp in August of 1969. And yet I played the football season when I should not have, should have been redshirted. But I was Joe Tasby, I was Superman, and I felt like I had to go. So my senior year, I would get cortisone shots, get my knee drained before games, and having my leg taped from my hip to my ankle, just so I could play, filling it for a painkiller. So my senior year, I was 2 or 3 steps slower. So the greatest agony for me up at that time was when in 1970, they did not call my name for the pro draft. This, I didn't know it at the time, but it would take years for me to understand what that did to me from the standpoint of me trying to reach forward and do other things, and how that put a damper on some of the things that I wanted to do. So after graduating from Idaho, BS in education, came home for a year, worked in the community with the community development, the OEO program, community development, that sort of thing, working to help bring things together for Black people. Then I got the fellowship to go to MIT to work on my master's in city planning. And I took off and went, ready, full fellowship. That's where I met Doc in 1971, when one of my placement was with SCLC. And that's when Doc pulled off the great Save Our Cities exposition in Boston, where we brought corporations, Black businesses, small and large companies, to public education to come together to try and really try and help pull up and reflect on what we could do to better the lack in our communities. During this time, I've run programs and particularly when it comes to economic development and education. When I left Boston after 5 years and came back to Houston, I came back to head up Operation Breadbasket of Texas, which was similar to Dr. Leon Sullivan's efforts in training, teaching, educating Black folks and other minorities in the trades, the construction trades, and other non-academic careers to help them develop so they could take care of their families, raise their children, and try and join in this quote unquote middle class. During that time, I led boycotts. I led demonstrations. In Houston, I used to meet with the heads of the TV stations to get them to open up the media for Black reporting, for Blacks in the media. I was on the first line in that. Also, we led boycotts against First City National Banks. We're talking 75, 76, because back then you didn't have Blacks represented in banks, tellers, none of that. So we were able to negotiate and get those kinds of get those kinds of things released, so we could begin to do that with Black people. So after those, continually working in the community, I finally went into the classroom. I've had about 25 years, about 30 years experience in education, teaching, coaching, particularly across the board, dealing with kids, children in distress situations, the community, who did not have the background or the development in the basics, the educational basics, life basics, if you will. Like right now where we are, we have parents raising students or raising their children who the parents themselves did not have, who were not brought up with a communal or with understanding, with self-discipline, with respect. So where we are right now is a direct result of not having a generation or two really having the guidance, the teaching, the discipline, the development of their minds, the understanding of what should motivate a desire for internal growth or development, other than what you hear on the computer or the TV or in certain music that leads them to be idle in their minds and think that they can get something or the world owe them something because of the fact that they are here. Right now, we're in the midst of where we are in this country with the Black Lives Matter movement. All people matter, but we have to understand that when we lost when we were in segregation in the Black schools, we had, like I say, in excellence. We were taught by the same token in conjunction with what we got at home, our communities, in our block. There were elders, there were people who would stop you if you would throw it off or doing something you didn't have any business doing. They would speak up and tell you, you know that ain't right, boy, you better get home. And so we had a different kind of a support base that to us was natural. And as we grew up, many of us who became successful felt that when we look back at our brothers and sisters now coming up who don't have that support, who don't have that guidance, we look at them and say, well, they're not doing anything, or they can't do it. They can't pull themselves up. No, they can't pull themselves up. We forgot them. And so now we look back and say, wow, or look at them. Now it's us. So what we are working with at this point, and what we've been working with for some years now, is how do we develop and deal with the social and emotional issues of our community, of children and young adults and their parents,
right?
Okay, who are basically lost, who think that if I can't get some welfare, I'm gonna be jammed up. But there are ways to work this so that you have self-esteem building, you have self-discipline, where we can get the attention of these young people and their parents to the reality of what's going on right now in the world. Mm-hmm. One, nobody owes you anything.
Right.
Two, you have a fortress of values and historical strength behind you, but they don't get that.
Right. Joe, what I'd like you to do, I think people will really appreciate the generation when the elders made the success of the young people their business too.
Yes,
and that's
sir.
why people of our generation are able to have something to offer those, like you say, who were, so we forgot them in a sense.
Yes.
And that's true. Institutionally, we've forgotten, including the church.
Oh,
so,
yes, definitely.
So I suspect that as we go forward, when you do your big video, you'll lay out for them some of the dynamics and steps so that people will know how do we get this back, so to speak, you know? And I just appreciate so much that we have, you know, the Good Samaritan was not only somebody who cared about the man in the ditch, but he also had some resources. He owned the camel. He has his own camel, and he had his credit card and all that. So what I'd like to do, Joe, is let's have Dr. Fred Smith now share with us some of the healing and different dimensions of the work he's done with churches, and also across denominations and theological schools, higher education, where we'll come back to where you want to resume it again, because he will show us some institutional infrastructure that allow us to go among the people who are hurting and bring wholeness and healing. I'm happy to introduce at this time Dr. Fred Smith, who has a long career in health issues, ministry, theological education, higher education, and he will share with you some of his background. And then we will return to pick up where Brother Joe left off when he said, we forgot them. And that's where we're going to start after Dr. Smith, after Fred Smith shares with us his own journey and why he sees what he sees and why he does what he does now. Brother Fred, would you please? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Woods. And I want to thank Brother Tasby too. It was fascinating hearing that story. I identify myself as a prophetic religious educator. I have spent a great deal of my time of my life teaching public religious education. And we can define that at another time. I won't take time doing that, but I want to do some of that right now. My basic methodology is narrative, is story. And oftentimes I found that much of life lessons come of stories, often of tragedy and trauma. So I'm going to tell 3 of those stories briefly right now, and we can get into more detail of the implications of them at another time. The first story really came to mind to me when I was watching on, I thought it was Netflix, Judas and the Black Messiah. I grew up in Oakland, California, in West Oakland, just a few blocks really from Merritt Junior College. So Huey P. Newton, Elvis Cleaver, Fred Hampton for that matter, you know, were not strangers in our neighborhood, and the Black Panthers were a very powerful group. This was in the late 60s, and I was in high school at the time. And I even had a black tam and a leather jacket, and I was what I call a wannabe at the time. I have friends, and one of the favorite places we like to go during spring break really was there in Oakland at Mills College, which is a girls' college. Some of my friends were there, and we would go there and play on the grass and so forth. On April 4th, 1968, I was a junior, a rising senior, a junior in McClymonds High School in Oakland, California, School of Champions. Bill Russell, Fada Pinson, Kurt Flood, many athletes were there, and I was an athlete too. But anyway, we were out playing ball, and somebody called from one of the dorm rooms, come quick, they killed King. And that was really one of the first tragic stories. So I was in the West, so I wasn't a part of the Southern movements, but we saw it on TV every night, and we admired, and we was just installed. So the death of King really hit me hard. I mean, it really hard, and it really made a great impression upon me that I began to buy all the tapes or records and listen to every sermon that he ever preached, including the I Have a Dream speech, mountaintop speech. I mean, on and on and on. And so I almost began to memorize them. And so that shaped everything else in my life, because after that, people began to call me a race man. Because Langston Hughes was one of my favorite authors, and Just Be Simple and those guys, and talking about a race man, because I was concerned about the Black race. I wound up going to Harvard. I wanted to go to Fisk because W. Du Bois was one of my heroes. Souls of Black Folks was one of my canons. Double Consciousness is one of my chief psychosocial hermeneutical lens into Black life. And so, but they didn't have any money at Fisk, and we were poor. Harvard gave me a full ride. Harvard, Stanford, and Cal Berkeley. And so I went purposely to study economics, because I felt that was part of the key to what had happened. During that time, it was the Vietnam War, it was Cambodia money, so there was all kinds of unrest on the campus at all times. And I lived through that, but I always kept the vision, of the beloved community before me, even at that time. I couldn't articulate it. I didn't have a theory about it. I just knew about it. And so that really began to shape most of my life. When I got out of school, I came to Houston, Texas. I married a young lady at Wellesley College, who was at Wellesley, who went to Yates, and started to go into, while I was in Oakland, I also worked at Kaiser Aluminum as an intern. And that's when Kaiser Permanente was getting started. And that's when I began to understand, and they opened the West Oakland Health Clinic, one of the first community health clinics, federally qualified community health clinics in the country. And I was on the board of that because I was the president of the high school. That gave me interest in health. And I wrote my senior thesis on HMOs as a cure or as a solution for the health problem of African Americans and poor in the community. And so when I came back to Houston, I enrolled in Baylor School of Business and the University of Houston in the combined program and health administration. But I got married, had a child, and so I started working in the banks and so forth. Until I got called into the ministry, to make the long story short, at Holman Street Baptist Church, where at that time a very young Pastor Manson C. Johnson was preaching, and he was just getting started. And at that time, even though I'd been in church all my life, I accepted the Lord there, because I had been going through some trauma. I went through a divorce at that time. I had my first child, and I was at probably the lowest point of my life. And that church took me in and nurtured me. I was practically homeless. Like I was homeless, basically, took me in. And so I got my call to the ministry. Wound up going back to Methodist Church and blah, blah, blah. That went. I wound up pursuing my PhD. I mean, I got my Master of Divinity at Southern Methodist, Perkins. I was president of Black Seminarians. I worked with Cecil Williams, and J. Alfred Smith Sr., and all those guys, as a president of Black Seminarians conference. But that's the story I want to get to. Well, while I was at Emory studying under James Fowler and Fred Craddock and others, I was doing a study in Orlando, Florida, to look at ethics in public education. And that was part of I was working with the Center for Faith and Moral Development, looking at faith development theory with James Fowler. We were trying to create ethics programs for schools, middle schools, and so forth, Fowler, Lunicon, and a number of others. But while I was there, I got a call that my nephew, 16 years old, Hyson, who was my brother's son, who had been in the military, had gotten a young lady pregnant. They didn't get married. That's in many other cases, the young man went to stay with my mother, his grandmother. We lived in the projects, the Acorn projects at the time. And so there wasn't a whole lot of room there, but I was away at school all the time anyway, so he slept in my room. And he was a precocious young man, had big brown eyes, you know, the kind of eyes that sort of draw you in every time you look at him. I think his eyes were too big for his head, really, you know. Wonderful young kid. And I had, and, you know, I like to put my awards and stuff on the wall. So I had my Honor Society awards and all that kind of stuff, you know, on my wall in my room. He started taking them down and putting his own up, which I was thrilled about. I was an athlete too, Joe. I played football at Harvard. I was a linebacker, you know, I played middle guard, you know, and center. That I was jack of all trades, but mostly I played monster back. Anyway, so I'd come home and we played basketball. And every time I would come home, things began to change. This was in the 80s now, okay, in the mid 80s, and crack cocaine hit our community. And we were poor, and High Son got involved in it. We didn't know what that was. You know, my folks were country folks. You know, we were church people, Church of God in Christ. And here was this young man in our house now, you know, that we knew something was wrong. My mother kept calling me, High Son is getting in trouble. I would come home and I would speak to him about Martin Luther King, and I would speak to him about all kinds of stuff, you know. But what I found, Brother Joseph, and brother, that my education had educated me out of my community, really. You know, I really couldn't relate, you know. Then I got a call later on that High Son had been shot 3 times in the back of the head on the streets of Oakland. You know, and apparently he had went up to Stockton, California and shot somebody else as a revenge killing. And that just broke me. But out of that, you know, I began to get involved in the community. I worked with cities and schools. I worked with high schools and everybody else, dealing with teen pregnancy, dealing with every kind of issue you could think of, you know, and starting programs, you know, and so forth. And then something happened. Crack cocaine had gotten so bad, you know, that the Methodist Church, Bishop Felton Mays was the Bishop of Washington, D.C., stepped down and said he's going to tackle this issue. And the Commission on Pan-Methodist Cooperation decided to jointly, all the Methodist denominations, to come together to address the issue of substance abuse, you know, and violence. And lo and behold, they called me up and asked me to be an editor on a joint program with the 4 Methodist denominations, you know, to work with, to get churches to get involved in their communities around substance abuse and its related violence. We took a tour around the country, going to different communities. They would take me around as they were preparing me to be the editor. And when I would listen and talk to people over and over, what I would get is kids not believing they're going to get to be 18 or to ever grow up. And that was some of them, that was a fall. They saw so much death. They were trapped in these communities and they had no hope. And I said to myself, you know, out of this, you know, all the thing that we could do, the best thing we could do is to bring hope. And that we need a revival, a spiritual revival, a revival of hope. And so we put the 4 Methodist denominations together, and we began to create this curriculum based upon Christian shared practice. Thomas Groom out of Boston College worked, you know, as a basis of it. And I became an expert in it, you know, and we were doing that. Then I said to myself, well, you know, churches don't usually do this. There's really no market for this kind of curriculum. We have to create one. And so we began to go around with all the Methodists, 4 Methodist denominations in every community, and the Baptists and Church of God in Christ got involved too. We created Revival of Hope coalitions in 33 cities around the country. And we would go from 1 to 1, and that's where the curriculum was taking places. At every general conference, we showcased the curriculum, you know, and by that time, I had done everything for my PhD work, but my dissertation. And I had one more exam to take, an ethics exam, which I took with Robert Franklin, you know, and others for my ethics exam. And I passed it, and I started writing my dissertation. And my dissertation was a prophetic religious education for Black boys. Without a vision, we perish. And so I began to write a curriculum called Prophetic Religious Education based upon vision. But while I was doing that, President Carter was building the Carter Presidential Center And Bill Foege, who had been over the CDC, was now the president of it, who now is a consultant to the Gates Foundation, took it over, and they were trying to address the Healthy People 2000 goals. And they began to say, well, it's the same problem we're having now with the pandemic. How are we going to reach the poor people, the people of color, with these goals? And Carter, being a good Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher, and Bill Foege, being a child of a missionary, said the churches can do it. And so they got $1 million from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and created the Interfaith Health Program. And my professors recommended me to be a part of that as a research associate, because we had a database of 2,000 churches that were involved in all kinds of health programs. We worked with the government and everything. And so I began to do that as research assistant. Soon I moved up to associate director for violence substance prevention. And at that time, thousands of kids were dying from gun violence every year. Children dying of gun violence, 25,000 a year were dying of gun violence. And so we want to say, what can we do about that? And we went with the CDC and met with the violence prevention department, Rosenberg, Jim Mercy, and others. And they brought in folks from the RAND Corporation and a number of different organizations, public health. We began to talk about it. Then they said, we need to set a goal for this initiative. And Gary Gunderson, a good friend of mine who was the director of the Interfaith Health Program, I was associate, we were sitting at the table. We were the only preachers sitting at the table. Everybody else were public health, doctors, law enforcement. And they said, well, maybe if we cut the 25,000 in half. And we said, you mean 15,000, 12,000 folks, children died? That's not acceptable. So maybe cut down to 10,000. No, 10,000, what if we cut it down to 5 or 6? So what are you going to say that one mother whose child died? So not even one's death by child's death, one by gunfire is either inevitable or acceptable. And so we created the Not Even One program, which was based upon what's called Sentinel Event Response Teams. In child maternal health, when a mother dies or a child dies in childbirth, that's an event that shouldn't happen. And so they combine an interdisciplinary team to look at everything from the social settings to the procedures to everything that they can think of, try to find out what went wrong in this instance, and then try to correct that so it won't happen again like that. So we said, well, why not do that in communities? Why not bring together ministers, the garbage collectors, teachers, whoever makes up that community? And every time there's a death, we're not going to do a criminal investigation. We're going to do a public health investigation. We're going to look at how that gun got into the community. We're going to look at the environment in which this happened. We're going to look at not just the one that was killed or the one that was shot, but both of those are victims of it. And so we're going to try to find a solution. And so we did that in Atlanta. And then we wound up doing it in 13 different cities, including Compton, New Mexico, which was dealing with suicide among the Native Americans, Philadelphia. I think we did some in DC and Oakland and so forth. As we developed these Not Even One coalitions. And they had impact. They had evaluation in those communities. And one of the things it was built on, one ideas was built on, really the basic was the 10-point coalition out of Boston with Dorothy Petro Stiff, and Gene Rivers and those guys. So a lot of the stuff that we did, was help to look at each individual community and then build around that a coalition and resources that attack specific issues. So that's my second story. My final one is really making a full circle back here to Houston, Texas. Where I was professor of public theology at Houston Graduate School of Theology. Ran into a little trouble there, around issues of race and so forth. I don't want to get into all that, but I left. But when I left almost homeless again. Because I had no income. I was broke. But I had held a major summit on faith and health, and Madison Johnson came and brought 12 of his people from Holman Street to it, and he called me up soon after that. And I was in the next state, and he helped me get my apartment that I stay in now. He bought this computer that I'm looking at right now because he thought I ought to have something, decent, and he helped me survive. But then he called me, and then he told me the reason why he was doing that, because he wanted me to help him build a wellness center, a medical wellness center in 3rd Ward. that could service not just the medical need, but gymnasium, swimming pool, jacuzzis, telemedicine, nutrition, kitchen, cooking classes, the whole 9 yards to really address the whole person. And he had 9 acres there, right there at the University of Houston, which he was going to develop right to the church, this huge thing. I took him to Memphis, Tennessee, to look at the Church Health Center, which does exactly what he was talking about already. Scott Morris, a medical doctor and a Methodist minister, created a Church Health Center, which is world famous. So we toured it. He said, I wish I could just plop this down right here in Houston. So we had a big meeting on that in February where we had bankers and we had newspaper people, we had architects, we had the dean of the medical college at University of Houston was sitting there, who I find is a very religious man, very, very, very religious person. And they got a medical college there that is different from any other that I've ever seen in the country, because they're actually training doctors to work in communities of the poor. And they're recruiting Black and Hispanic students. That more than 60% of their new class was Hispanic or African-American medical students. And so I was looking at how about having a partnership. But then in March, COVID hit. Everything shut down. And the pastor began, who I love dearly, did believe it. He thought it was a hoax, or something that was made up. And he said we were covered by the blood. He was covered by the blood, and he ignored all the public health, issues, and was getting ready to hold big meetings and so forth. And I said, no, Pastor, I love this dude more than anything else. He has saved my life practically, but I thought he was wrong. And I told him so, not in public, very privately, just between him and me, but he didn't like that. That's lack of faith on my side, but anyway, on May 31st, he died of COVID, and from there, the only thing that, I really dreamed about that concept of being covered by the blood for days. The Lord showed it to me. And then I began to write about it. One of my colleagues, former colleagues, who was at Perkins, who's the president of the Practical Theology Association, with the worldwide organization of practical theologians, asked me to do the keynote address. I had been out of it for a while, but she remembered me, asked me to do an address at the biannual conference. And I did an address called Covered by the Blood. I got tremendous response, from it. And in fact, several professors called me up. They wanted to come down, look at Houston. They wanted me to write an article for a journal, which I didn't do, religious education, which I didn't do. But I began to continue that in my heart. And I began to think, that the vaccine is a gift from God, and it's the blood, that if we can take some grapefruit juice and some pieces of bread and say, this is the blood, this is the body, and you take it into it, we can take this vaccine and say, this is the blood of Christ given for you, and I was thinking about, starting in Ash Wednesday and having 40 days of prayer. Well, and one of the things I wanted to do was to have the church becoming vaccine centers. I went to Houston Department of Health, and I talked about it. And then finally, I got a call. I was holding this Zoom from the dean of the medical college. He was holding this summit. I sent you an invitation, Virgil. He was holding this summit on health equity and COVID. He and that's supposed to be on the 19th. Well, we had the cold front that didn't happen. But he wanted me to meet with him on the 22nd. I went to the office. We started talking. I asked about his faith journey, and so forth. He's a son of a missionaries grew up in Ecuador, but his faith is strong to him. And he said, but you know what? This is really providential you came today. We got 300 doses of vaccine for our clinic. Our clinic is located here in the University of Houston, which is hard to get to. You've been talking about this. Do you think Holman Street want to do it? So I called up the deacons. They said, heck yeah. And so last Saturday, we gave out 200 doses of vaccine to the community, mostly African Americans and Hispanics. 1 or 2 white folks showed up, you know, because they heard about it. But now that, you know, we give our second dose on April 10th, you know, and we're in line to be continuing to do that. But my goal was to develop the protocols and so forth so we can do it in many different churches. That really, if we're going to do health equity and equity distribution of the vaccine, it has to be done at a local level with people that are trusted, and that's the faith community. So those are my 3 stories, and that's what I do.
Fred, what you have just ended with reminds me that I'll stay there for a minute on the point that what you're doing now, right now, in the middle of it right now, is a right now service or right now ministry. And what we find ourselves often is we're doing a long range piece and we're not doing the right now piece, and we don't get the credibility. So if we make sure we're always doing a right now piece, as long as preparing for the long-term piece, in other words, the difference between urgency and important, I'd like to have you each ask each other one question based on what you've heard from each other. And I think that helps us to think about how do we make this, you know, operational. That's the word. Workable, functional.
Brother Tasby, where do we go from here? Where do we go from right now?
I was going to ask you the same thing. Where we go from here is to, when we talk about the importance of partnerships, community partnerships, the churches, if we'll have to church differently, but we have to be able to teach or train these communities, these parents, how to help their children, teenagers, young adults. How do you help their children right now? Because we have to clock them right where they are. Like you said earlier, Fred, about not being able to identify with your nephew, because so we have to. I'm in a neighborhood. I live 5 minutes from my high school. The gangs shoot up and down the streets here all the time, right? It's a real thing. These youngsters, we see them, we talk to them, we try and inspire them through we use social theater, we use academics, we use affirmation, we use different techniques, methods to help them first to get their attention and help them begin to see something different inside themselves and how that means and what that spells in their community as far as their family, because you got to start with them and their families and where they are right now right now. If you don't do that, you're going to be over their heads and you're going to miss them. And since if we don't do these, we lose the next generation and we lose all the footing and ground that we have accomplished, but we didn't accomplish it in mass as Black people, as far as a business model of reaching back and helping our communities. Because I remember when we had businesses, we had operations, we had the connection with the church. Church, we must reestablish a church connection that's real, that teaches. We can utilize churches in the afternoons to serve as places where children can come to learn, to be corrected, to be redirected, because we have overlooked the mental health aspect. And so many of these, right now they throw them in jail. They've been doing it for some time now, and then they release them back to the community. So we have to touch the mental health aspects, which means the spiritual input in a practical way that they haven't been getting. that the parents didn't get, so that you can reestablish hope. You can reestablish the worth of the self and how that works and how I can live better. That's what I think is key, because the work is here right now. I see it every day when I go out, when I drive out the gate to go down the street. We see the kids who you can tell haven't eaten recently. And I'm not talking about in relation to COVID, who haven't had their hair combed, who lack adequate clothing. And I'm not talking, like I said, I'm not talking about the year of COVID and how it has directed itself toward the what is weighing people down. But these things have been going on unanswered and unchecked and not looked at with a serious, direct look by ourselves. Because if we don't look at it with an eye to what it takes to help lift these right here, right now, then how do we take it to folks with resources and tell them we know how to do this? We know how to do it, but we've been without resources for a long time. We have partnerships with a couple of schools. The COVID stopped that progress in a way, but we still have been developing so that we can, the anti-bullying, the things that these kids deal with every day. And I'm talking about from preschool, adolescence through high school, and even college age. We can touch, we can reinfuse them and teach them things that they don't have now. It's out in the ether somewhere, but we can show them it's every day and they have it within themselves. It just needs to be touched and opened up and then guided. And we have the auspices and the organization and the teams to do that. So where do we go from here is we have to continue what we're doing, but it would be excellent to have a base of resources we could go to put some things in motion right now. We utilize sports, music, social theater. We utilize those things as tools to touch and bring in and interest the lives of these young people. At the same time, parent partnership is key. Church partnership is key, but even so, the parent partnership with what we're doing to help these youngsters is so pertinent. We must have that. But here again, resources, places to do this at. We have presentations, we have PowerPoints, we have teams in place that can bring presentation, that can show where we are, how we do it, and why we do it, and why it's necessary to continue to do it on a larger basis.
Since you all each asked the same question, now, Fred, what is your answer? Joe asked you the same question you asked him.
We live now in a Kairos moment. We're at an inflection point. All the stable systems that we have seen, healthcare, economics, police, you name it, has been disrupted by the pandemic, by the political unrest, by climate change, with the ice storm, you name it, God, and for me, this is God sent. Because now we have an opportunity to do all those things we've been talking about doing for years, because the systems are broken and everybody can see it. The pandemic, you got to talk about the pandemic, because when this pandemic begins to come to an end, it's not going to go back as things as usual. The church has changed. It is, its relationship to its buildings has changed. How it communicates and how it defines its congregation has changed. The health system is broken, and must change. Before they could play around with it and tinker with it, and now it has to happen. But for the greatest thing, that I think is important is that we're in a small window. I don't know how long that window is going to be, where the political fortunes have changed drastically, and because all the other things that we've talked about has changed. And right now, there's going to be a great white backlash. They're already trying to, suppress the vote, and to change the rules. But that doesn't matter. We have opportunity now. For me, it is for us stepping into this opportunity. The resources are there, Joe. They just passed a $2 trillion bill to deal exactly with the issues that you're talking about. The reason why the pandemic has taken such a big effect is because we call it the social determinants of health. That's what you've been talking about, and people realize that now. Before, you couldn't make that case. Now you can. So the idea is not that it's the lack of resources, it's just making a connection to those resources. It's seeing the opportunity and step boldly into it. That's where we are right now. So we have opportunity. The future is up to us. There are forces right now that want to take us backward, and they will if they have an opportunity. But there are also forces now that want to take us forward, and we can begin to imagine a new future. So I think the only thing that limits us now is our imagination. What can we imagine, Joe? What can we see?
Here's what I want to do now. I like the way you guys have connected there, and you're saying the same thing initially. Number one, the money is there. Let's go get it.
That's right.
All right, that's number one. Number two, I want y'all to continue talking together and put a plan together. Let's assume that we might have to be virtual for a whole year. Let's put together something that we could stay virtual for a year if we needed to, so that we can be in the homes of people with information and inspiration. That's where the imagination is going to come from. It's not our imagination. It's the imagination that we share with the people that they embrace.
Yeah.
That's every time. That's the man at the pool. And when Jesus told him what to do, all of a sudden he imagined and did it right away. He didn't plan to do it. He just did it. So we got to do something immediately that brings some kind of relief to people, even if it's in their head first. That's where your imagination, it's got to be in the head and the heart first. Even if you don't have bread, silver and gold have we none. But there's some silver and gold out there. Let's go get it. So here's what I suggest. I want you two of you to keep talking with each other. Come up with some things that we can go after the 1.9 resource. There's something in there that we can do virtual with these families and hook up with somebody out here now who's already doing some of the stuff. I suspect that we ought to look at what are the strategies that allow us to take advantage of the technology and get impact in people's lives pronto.
Okay, Fred, listen, what I'd like to do is set up a time with you and 2 or 3 members of my team to break out a little bit more of where we are with the Celebrate Yourself program. Then you can help me look at where we can go, how we can use this and what we want to do. Because I think it's very pertinent. Okay, I'll call you and we'll set it up, a Zoom, where we can do that.
Okay.
Sounds great.
Well, we've shared with folks some of our workshopping here, and it's going to impact what we do here, but folks elsewhere who will hear these tapes will see the kind of process that they can go through where they are. I want to thank you both for this time together.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank Dr. Hall, Dr. Ralph Hall, as he helps facilitate some of these things. Thank you much.
Sounds great. Thank you, guys. Take care. I'll be in touch, Brother Fred.